All right, so before we start, there's one question that Padre Rinpoche in his Words of My Perfect Teacher. I don't know whether you're aware of this book. There's a book called Words of My Perfect Teacher, a translation from the Tibetan text by Padre Rinpoche. So he mentioned as the eighth suffering, I guess, encountering what one doesn't want, and not like Lama Tsongkhapa, the five aggregates. So do you know why? What's the reason for that? I don't know. I mean, there's like so many different ways of categorizing suffering. The thing is, like, if that's the eighth suffering, encountering what one does not want, well, that is also part of the eight sufferings. So, for example, the fifth suffering is encountering of what is unpleasant. So this is the same as encountering that which one doesn't want. It's similar. And then the suffering of not getting what we want. So those two are similar, what is mentioned here. Then I'm wondering what would be the eighth one, because the one that you mention here, encountering what one does not want, is already part of the eight.
It's those getting, separating for a loved one, meeting the one that you don't like, getting what you don't want, and not getting what you want.
So being separated from loved ones, that's extra. Being separated from the loved ones. That seems to be the one that's different in here. As part of the eight? On page 15. The suffering of encountering what is unpleasant, the suffering of the separation from what is pleasant, the suffering of not getting what we want, and the suffering of having the five aggregates. So it seems like being separated from loved ones.
Encountering what is unpleasant is like missing the enemy. Separation for what is pleasant is like separation from loved one. The suffering of not getting what we want, and then getting what we don't want. So that's the eighth one.
Yeah, well, I mean, here, Lama Tsongkhapa, what you mentioned as number 8 and what you mentioned as being number 5, it's the same. What is unpleasant, being separated from loved ones, it includes both.
Yeah, but it's like the suffering of not getting what we want, it's also unpleasant.
Yeah, so encountering getting something that you do not want and not getting what you want. So it's like, you see, looking at it from a different angle. So encountering that which you do not like could mean the death of a person. You encounter the death of a person, right?
No, I get it. I just wondered why you mentioned the suffering
of having the five aggregates. Right. I mean, I'm saying, there's just different ways of categorizing it. My guess is here that, according to Padre Rinpoche's explanation, number 5, he puts another subdivision, which is here not mentioned, and instead saying, like, just having the 5 aggregates is the problem. So, you see, like, these masters, oftentimes when they set forth those explanations, they did according to disciples. Oftentimes there were certain disciples who they gave a specific teaching to, and Padre Rinpoche's disciple, for them it was helpful to hear it this way, whereas Lama Tsongkhapa's disciple, it was helpful to hear it that way. I guess it's just, but of course there's also a sutric source. I'm certain that there's a sutric text they base this on. Here, the quote that is given, what I've given here, is the quote by Nagarjuna, who mentions the 8 types of suffering in his letter to a friend, but then he just says, yeah, and the others, exactly. So he doesn't really mention which ones those are, but in a way they include one another, right? So the exact reason I cannot give you why exactly it's different, but my guess would be that according to the disciples' needs and aspirations at the time, a teaching was set forth slightly differently. And then also I got here a question: what or who is the one who decides to whom and how we'll be born to? Okay, so what decides where we're born to? Okay, number 1, unfortunately we can't decide. Unfortunately, we don't really have any control over where we're reborn. But even if we were to, I mean, there are certain things we can decide, of course. There are certain things that we can make a decision about. So who or what is making the decision? Good question. Is it a self? Is there a type of self that is separate from mind and body that makes that decision? No, of course not. There's no such a self prescribed in Buddhism. But then we could ask, for example, what is it that walks when we walk? Right? To ask the question, what is exactly walking? Well, what is walking? We say the person walks, but that person is just labeled. So what is it actually labeled upon? Because there's no separate I. It's not like your body walks and some invisible I is being picked up and it also kind of walks. That doesn't happen, even though we have a sense that happens. So really, what is walking? Our legs. Right? Our legs are walking. Our legs are walking. Not everything about our legs, there's certain parts that do not move, that are just being moved along, but basically it's our foot that moves, and the ankle and our knees, they move. And in dependence on that, and of course the brain, that is part of the activity. Well, there's the mind that wants to walk. I don't think there's any involuntary walking. Maybe if you're sleepwalking, but even then it's to be seen whether it's involuntary or not. Anyway, so every part of the body that, every part of the body that is responsible for the walking. On the basis of that, we impute the person, right, in that moment. And then what is actually walking, when you look for it, well, it's the legs and the brain and so forth. They're all part of that mechanism. So likewise, when we make a decision, now deciding where we're going to be reborn, we can decide that once we're highly advanced. But as an ordinary person, there's not much decision. There's not much room for decision. But anyway, let's just take another example. Who makes the decision to come to this retreat or not? Well, it's an awareness. It's a consciousness that pops up thinking, got nothing better to do. Or, whatever was the reason. So there's a thought, let's do this. Do I have the time? Do I want to be here for a whole weekend? Okay, kind of weighing it back and forth. So different awarenesses going back and forth. And eventually an awareness made the decision, okay, I'm going to go. So on the basis of that, we impute I made the decision. Of course, there was really just an unconsciousness, a mind that came to that conclusion, right? So that would be the answer to that. So we just impute I on the basis of those thoughts, which are not the I, because the I is always there. The thoughts are not always there. So in that moment, those thoughts, when they arose, we imputed I on the basis of that. Is there a separate I that made the decision? No. And then also, this is your question, Shoshana? No. I just connected. Okay. All right. So, and then, so that was the first, that was the question. And then there was a comment here. So in Hebrew, the words suffer and patience origin or come from the same root. That's also interesting. That's nice. All right, so let's be patient when we suffer. Which doesn't mean...
So in English, bear with me.
Forbearance, or forbearance, bear with me. But where does the suffer come? That's true, but here the origin, the word bear doesn't have the connotation of suffer. But in Hebrew, as far as I don't know Hebrew, but as far as I understand, the same root for the word suffering, or the root for the word suffering is the same as the word for patience. Right? Yeah? So, that's basically also, it's beautiful actually, it's kind of a teaching in itself, as in well, if you can't change it, be patient. But it doesn't mean if there's a remedy, we have to be patient. If there's a remedy to suffering, well, let's apply the remedy and rather not suffer, unless there's some benefit to suffering. There can be, of course. But, of course, if we can totally eliminate suffering, we don't need to bear suffering to grow, because we don't need to grow any longer, because we've already reached the highest state possible, right? Okay, well, thank you for those. Those are helpful, those comments and questions. All right. But now to the... Yes? Impatience. To some people, being patient may be a type of suffering. Yeah, who knows? Okay, anyway, so let's go to page, 40-something, the origin. of suffering? 43. So the origin of suffering. So where does that come from? Why do we suffer? And well, the way it's explained, usually it's explained karma and afflictions, but of course it's afflictions first and then karma. So afflictions or afflictive emotions, negative emotions, so certain states of mind that are responsible for suffering. So, first of all, there's two principal causes. There's two principal causes. One is afflictions, the other is karma. And the main cause here is affliction. Affliction itself is the kind of main cause, or afflictions are the main causes. First of all, they induce actions, volitional actions, or actions of body, speech, and mind, which are called karma. That's called karma. These actions of body, speech, and mind, they induce those. But they are also indispensable for the ripening of a karma. In particular, when we die at the time of death, the fact that we are reborn is because at the time of death, a karma ripens. If it didn't ripen, we wouldn't be reborn. We would still continue existing, but we wouldn't be reborn. We wouldn't be reborn in an uncontrolled way as a result of karma. So, but why does the karma ripen? Because there's an affliction. There's at least a grasping onto I at the time of death, and that leads to the ripening of a new karma. Okay, so in that way, afflictions work together with karma. Now, what are afflictions? There's a text by Asanga, a great Indian scholar, an Indian master, in his Compendium of Knowledge, or Abhidhamma Samuccaya. In that text, he defines afflictions as, or it says here, an affliction is defined as a phenomenon in particular here, a state of mind, that when it arises with the characteristic of being disturbing, and that through arising disturbs the mental continuum. So an afflictive emotion, basically, so a definition, I don't know, but it's like defined as in like its main attributes is that it disturbs the peace of mind. If previously we were content and peaceful and happy, when an affliction arises, that contentment, that peaceful state of mind goes away or is disturbed, is disrupted. So therefore we say that afflictions are mental states that disturb or unsettle the mind. But not only do they do that, so not only do they destroy the mind's peace and tranquility, moreover, they're wrong consciousnesses. They're not in accordance with reality. So again, being a consciousness, being in an awareness, an affliction, an afflictive emotion has an object, always has an object, and it does something with the object. Like I said yesterday, any awareness, any consciousness is an agent which has an object that it does something with. So by explaining what the object is, what the mind does with the object, we can understand these different afflictions. So we just give these names, the name anger to a particular affliction according to its object and what it does with the object. We give the name attachment to a particular consciousness or awareness with regard to its object and what it does with the object. So all the different types of consciousness, the different categories, we give those different names to them, we classify them by way of looking what their objects are and what they do with these objects. Okay? And at the same time, well, doing that, it allows us to understand those afflictions better. And first, of course, there's an external explanation of what an affliction is without us being able to identify them from our own experience. But the whole point is that first, the Buddha explains, for example, what anger is, and then we look at our own mental continuum and try to identify our own anger, our own attachment. And when we're able to do that, we come to see how we are deceived by these afflictions. That when anger arises, it deceives us because its object does not exist. The object it takes to mind doesn't exist. Attachment, what it focuses on, its object, again, doesn't exist. It's not in accordance with reality. It's unrealistic. And when the mind arises in our continuum, it unsettles us. It destroys our peace of mind and our mental tranquility. jealousy, arrogance, all the different types of afflictions, they all do the same. So they make us unhappy when they arise. There's a sense of displeasure. Whatever happiness we experienced a moment earlier, that is no longer there. And they make us do things, crazy things, things that are not in accordance with reality. So our afflictions are extreme. They're extreme in the sense that they take to mind something that is not there. And that makes us do extreme things, right? And depending on how extreme the affliction is, according to that, the action is extreme. Such that afterwards, when we calm down, we go, oh my God, how embarrassing. Right? We're embarrassed. We just engage in an embarrassingly extreme action. All right? Yes, please? Yeah.
It's not that the object is not there.
Uh-huh.
Right?
It's not that the object is not there. Okay, let's see.
The way we perceive it.
Okay, so she's saying it's not that the object is not there. The object is not there the way we perceive it.
Like if I'm hungry,
Yes.
yeah, it's like a suffering of suffering.
Yes,
yeah?
yes, yes,
And there is food.
yes. Okay, let's look at this. So we'll get there in a moment. So don't forget what you just said. So when we are hungry, there's food. So the food is there.
Yeah.
So our hunger or the mind that craves the food, what does it focus on? That's the question. So just leave it. Let's leave it for now, and then we'll investigate in a moment. But there's a few things I want to say before we get to anger and attachment, because first I want to introduce the main affliction, which is called ignorance. In Tibetan, ignorance, I don't know, I don't like the word ignorance. I'm not a fan of the word ignorance because it's such a negative connotation. We're not ignorant, It's not like we have ignorance, but we're not ignorant, right? I mean, every now and then an ignorance arises, but the problem with saying I am ignorant, it seems to imply I'm always ignorant. But the ignorance is not always there. It's always there?
In my mind, yes. I always perceive everything is inherent.
But there's a difference between actively perceiving and it just appearing that way. I mean, it appears that way, that's true. But ignorance is a mental consciousness that actively perceives things to be inherently existent. I mean, what Leora says reflects sub-scholars who say something similar. They do say that ignorance is always there, but then there are others who would disagree. I don't know. I mean, maybe you're really aware of ignorance always being there. I'm not aware of that. No, but I'm not aware of that. But it's possible that there's always a misperception, somehow more subtle. Or maybe it's not always there, but it's any kind of small trigger could bring it up. I really don't know. So this is something you need to explore yourself. Like, are you aware of that misperception at all times? But my point is that saying we're ignorant, again, we also have wisdom. We also have intelligence. So when we say we have ignorance, it almost seems like there's nothing else. And it's just so denigrating. It's so negative because it has a very negative connotation, ignorance, as in like we don't know anything. A little bit it has that. Whereas the word misperception I prefer. It's like a misperception. It doesn't have that kind of negative connotation. Of course, misperception is negative. But that heaviness kind of falls away a little bit. So I prefer to say misperception of reality. But ignorance, I still use the word because there are actually two types of ignorance. There's a mere not knowing, just not knowing. That's a kind of ignorance. And then there's the misperception of something. So not only do we not know how something actually exists, but we perceive the opposite of what's actually there. Right? So the difference between those two is like we don't know the alphabet, we don't know how the engine of a car works, or we have a diametrically opposed kind of sense of what a car is, how it works. Like it's totally wrong, our perception. So another example would be we perceive that which is impermanent to be permanent. So that's a misperception of not merely lacking the understanding that phenomena are impermanent, but on top of that, perceiving them to be the opposite of impermanence, in other words, permanent. Okay, so those are the two types of misconception. And of course, the one that is more dangerous is the one that is diametrically opposed. Does everyone know this word? Diametrically opposed to reality? What's the Hebrew word to diametrically opposed? Like when you perceive exactly the opposite of what's there. So if you perceive that which is impermanent to be permanent, if you perceive that which is interdependent to be independent. Pardon? Diametrically, as in like opposite, you perceive, yeah, okay. So that's our main problem, those misperceptions, of misperceiving the opposite. For example, perceiving that which is in the nature of suffering to be in the nature of happiness. We did that when we went through the truth of suffering. Okay. Anyway, so those are all different types of misperceptions which potentially can cause us a lot of problems and difficulties. All right, and then there's one way of talking about deprecating misconception and superimposing misconception, just for the sake of getting a better sense of misperceiving something that does exist as being non-existent. That's a deprecating superimposition. In other words, deprecating as like, I don't know, maybe the word itself is so complicated that it's hard to, but deprecating just kind of refuting the existence of something that does exist. So, for example, an example of that kind of misperception would be the thought that my actions will not have consequences. That whatever I do, I will not experience the result of my actions. That is a misperception that denies the existence of something that does exist, because my actions do have consequences, but I deny that possibility. But then a superimposing misconception is perceiving something that does not exist to exist, right? So, for example, perceiving an I, a separate kind of I, an entity that is separate from mind and body, as being the self. That doesn't exist, okay? As I said earlier on, that which makes the decision with regard to, am I going to do this retreat or not, it's an awareness, it's a consciousness. It's not some separate I. But perceiving such a separate I is an example of a misperception that is called a superimposing, kind of adding something, in other words, perceiving something that actually does not exist to exist. Okay. And then there's also innate ignorance. There's again another way of classifying ignorance into innate and intellectually acquired. Not my favorite word, but anyway, innate is just something where instinctively we're born with these perceptions. Even as a child, you don't need to learn about these perceptions. We've had those before, and we still carry them into a next life. A sense of permanence, we're born with that. Perceiving ourselves as permanent, perceiving certain situations as lasting and permanent, perceiving of a permanent I. I like to ask this question. I usually do it after a while, after you've been sitting here for a while. I ask you, do you have a sense of a permanent I? A permanent self. So we all have a sense that there is a self that exists separate from mind and body, right? Oh, my memory is not very good. Like there's an owner of that memory. Okay, my mind is very distracted. Like there's an I that owns the mind, and that mind is very distracted. And then my body is this, that, or the other. So there's always this implication of an owner. And not only is there a sense that there is an owner, a separate I, there's also a sense of that I being permanent. Now, how can we recognize that I? I ask people, usually you came into this room around 3 o'clock, and is there a sense that your I is the same, that which came into the room? And yeah, it's the same I. Has the body changed? Oh yeah, because the pain that was absent 25 minutes ago or about half an hour ago is there suddenly. So obviously there's been some change. Physically, there's been some change. Now mentally, of course, too. Has your mind, has it been stuck in like the same thought when you came into this room? Did you have the same thoughts? Oh no, they've changed. You've had different thoughts in the meantime. So obviously your body has changed, your mind has changed, but there seems to be an I that is exactly the same. The I that came into the room, that sat down, that's been listening, all that kind of self, that's the same. So welcome. to your permanent I. Get to know your permanent I, right? Or at least you're superimposing misperception that perceives something that actually doesn't exist. In other words, a permanent, separate kind of I, right? Okay, and that is innate. You were not taught by your parents to believe in that. It's just naturally there for anyone. For little children, it's been there from the beginning, and as we grow older, it just continues on, and it takes on different aspects. I don't know. You may add, maybe when you perceive of your I as permanent, it takes on a certain form, or even a color, or I don't know. It may change that sense, but we all have an innate sense of such a permanent, separate I. And then, because we have that innate sense, whole philosophies are built on top of that. There are philosophies built on that. In some religious systems, you speak of a soul. Do you have a question? Yeah?
What is it? You seem to respond in a similar way to similar situations for all my life, and like similar things.
Yeah.
That's what makes this full of I.
Yes.
How I know myself.
Right. I mean, when you say you like certain things, from a Buddhist point of view, those are just types of awareness that come again and again. You know, like you have certain tendencies, certain habitual patterns, a certain way how to react to a situation. But when you look closer, those are just different states of mind that when the circumstances arise, they trigger those awarenesses. So we then impute I on the basis of that. We then say, oh, I just had a thought. There's nothing wrong with then imputing I on that consciousness, but what we do then is we add a separate I-ness, right? Something separate. But that is not in contradiction to the fact that, yeah, there are similar moments in our life where we do similar things. So similar thoughts arise. But that's all there is. It's just different thoughts arising. There is no separate self. So when you say, oh, but I made myself think. Well, for example, like you say, I say, for example, meditate on such and such. Let's do a meditation on the first 3 types of suffering. So then you give yourself the command to meditate. But really, it's not like a separate I saying, I should meditate now. No, there's an awareness arising. Oh, I want to meditate now. This is the time for me to meditate. So that awareness gives rise to actions in the body, sitting down in a specific way. That awareness then keeps, it's like this wish to meditate, first of all. And then after that has arisen, then a meditating mind arises. And when that meditating mind arises, there's another consciousness. It's like a mindfulness that, or an introspection, checking on the mind that's meditating. Is it really meditating, or is it thinking of yesterday and tomorrow? So just different awarenesses arising in our continuum, and they work very nicely together. They're just different consciousnesses. So at some point there may be the thought, oh, I really look forward to dinner. I like, I don't know, Trina. So I look forward to that. And then another thought arises. So just different consciousnesses arise. But is there like a controlling I, a control center or something? No. It's just different consciousnesses that work really nicely together. That's it. If you look for an I or a controlling consciousness, it doesn't exist. So that's what what Buddhism is saying. So all your experiences are in accordance with reality in the sense that you have thoughts, you have ideas, you have different thought, you have different likes and dislikes, and they pop up at different times of the day, right? But there's no controller as such. There's a sense there is, but there isn't. So the mind that perceives a controller is just another awareness that wrongly perceives something to be there that's actually not there. That's it. There's no controller. And and if you talk about the brain, for example, too, this is just something I don't know anything about this, but I read a little bit, and also from one of the Emory students who I once taught, who studied about this, she told me that there was a time in neuroscience when people believed there was be some kind of part in the brain that is mainly responsible, like a control center, that then is responsible for every other part in the brain. And nowadays, neuroscientists know that this is not the case, that there's just different parts of the brain that get activated according to the circumstances, and they work harmoniously with one another. There's not like a main kind of operating center or anything. It's just working very nicely, parts of the brain doing something here, there. So in the same way as with the parts of the brain that harmonize with some being active, becoming inactive, more active, and so forth, likewise with our mind. Different types of consciousness. Sometimes we're compassionate, and then that goes away, then maybe there's anger, and then that goes away, temporarily goes away, then there's attachment, jealousy. Oh, I should really work harder. So the wish to do something, and that's it. So on the basis of that, we say I. So we impute the I on different bases depending on what is mostly active. But there's no separate I. Though there's a sense there is, and on top of that separate I, it seems to be permanent. Yes, Duran.
I'd like to throw a couple of counter-arguments.
Can we leave the counter-arguments for the discussion group tonight? Sorry, because actually I'm a little bit off topic, and I need to go into this, but please keep it until tonight. Okay, great. All right, so this is therefore our innate sense of who we are then gives rise to ideologically, like certain ideologies, certain ideas that have developed in different societies based on that instinctive sense. So a sense of a soul. In psychology, I've mentioned here Freud's idea of an ego and a superego. So with regard to the I, or a sense like to be someone in the world, to be yourself, to be true to yourself. These ideas, they're not like ideologies in the sense that their whole philosophy is based on them, but they're very pervasive in society. This idea of being someone, as if there was someone separate, okay? Being someone special in this world, to make a difference. I make a difference. So all these kind of ideas of a separate self that are enhanced or that are elaborated on based on the innate sense of a self, okay? All right. So then there's, of course, other misperceptions too. There is an innate sense that our problems come from the outside. Even Tibetans who are born in a society that accepts karma, nonetheless, there's an instinctive sense, this person, that was their fault. It was his or her fault. So you blame others rather than putting the blame also on past actions. Of course, others do play a part, but unless we created the causes and conditions for a problem, we couldn't experience them. But we have a natural tendency to see the fault outside, to see the cause of our problems outside of ourselves. Okay, so that's one way. And I'm not saying that they're not people who kind of blame themselves for everything and so forth. That's just another extreme. But just saying in everyday life, oftentimes we just see one cause as the cause for our problem, and we don't see the entire picture. Okay? So intellectually, and then intellectually acquired, for example, another example of intellectually acquired misperception is seen from a Buddhist point of view, seeing the brain and the mind as being inseparable, and that when the brain disintegrates, the mind must disintegrate, and so therefore the idea that can't be past and future lives. Why? Well, there can't be anything after death because the brain and the mind are the same, and the brain obviously disintegrates. So that's a very strong, a contemporary sense that the past and future lives are impossible. It's impossible because brain and mind are the same. But of course, nowadays, as I've understood, the little that I've understood is there are like new new theories about the difference between brain and mind, because just recently I've read a few articles about people who had near-death experiences, and that when they had these near-death experiences, there was a time when their brain was totally inactive. There was no more activity of their brain. It was measured by physicians at the time. But then when they got back, when they were revived, they talked about having very vivid experiences. So mentally they had very vivid experiences, but the brain didn't do anything. So the idea that there can be a mental experience without the brain being active, surely there are different theories with regard to how that works, but the idea that mind and brain are exactly the same doesn't really hold, does it? Because if the mind is very active but the brain isn't, then they have to be existent on different levels, I guess. So anyway, so from a Buddhist point of view, yes, there's a very close connection between mind and brain, but the mind can nonetheless exist separate from the brain. Okay, so if you want to look it up, there's something on the BBC right now. I listened to it the other day. It's called Near-Death Experience. It's a program about spirituality, religion and spirituality. So I forget exactly the name. It's like a podcast you can download. I'll look it up and let you know later. But there's a podcast and you can download all these podcasts and it deals with those ideas. Okay. All right. But then of all the misperceptions that we've mentioned in general, there's of course the root misperception that underlies all the other misperceptions. In other words, there's a basic or fundamental misperception of reality that gives rise to all the other misperceptions. Our sense that phenomena have an inherent existence, an existence in and of themselves. That this table is a table in and of itself. That it holds some tableness from its own side, and that it has nothing to do with us just calling this a table, without this holding any tableness from its own side. Okay? So from a Buddhist point of view, this is not a table in its own right. We labeled as a table, so therefore it's a table. That's it. There's no table from its own side. And that is true for all phenomena. We label phenomena, we give them names, and therefore we make them into those things, but it seems they have these characteristics in and of themselves. So that misperception of reality is the underlying misperception. So that holds true for the sense of an I. There's a sense there's some intrinsic, inherent I-ness, that the I exists in and of itself. And that is true with regard to phenomena other than the I. Okay, that they seem to exist in and of themselves. Can we leave that to the discussion group? It seems, and we need to, because I know this discussion will go into a different direction, unfortunately, or the question and answer session. Okay. But from this misperception, those different misperceptions, all different types of other afflictions arise. So the first one here, there are 6 types mentioned, and those 6 types can be more extensively described as the 10 types. So we don't need to go into all of them, but the more interesting ones are attachment. So attachment is one of them. The first one is attachment. So how does attachment work? Now, unfortunately, with the way the book has been arranged, some of the charts have been a little bit out of sync. So, like the 5 views, the first 5 of the 5 views, or the 5 non-views, I should say. The first 5 are called the 5 non-views, and the last of the 10 afflictions are the 5 views. So 5 non-views, 5 views. So you can still find the words, but they're a little bit out of sync. Anyway, so the 5 non-views, so there are 5 states of mind. They're not really wrong views as such. They're more emotional states, for lack of a better word. Though ignorance is not really an emotional state, but they're not defined as much by like some kind of irrational thinking, if you like, by a kind of way of it's like this and it's not like that. It has less of that kind of decisive misperception. So the 5 views are like the decisive misperceptions, whereas the first 5, they're misperceive reality, but they don't have that decisiveness with regard to how they perceive an object. Anyway, so attachment. What is attachment? Now, attachment is described as a state of mind, and the easiest way to understand attachment is to see how it arises. So attachment arises out of a misperception of reality, perceiving there to be an intrinsic I, a kind of separate intrinsic I, some intrinsic positive or an intrinsic other person. So when you're attached to, let's say, another person, there seems to be some intrinsic color essence of a person. You perceive an essence of a person, something. I don't know what word to use, but like some intrinsic, objective personness over there. right? So Jonathanness, or I don't know, Leoralessness, or Shukiness, or whatever. Shukiness or Leoralness. So some essence over there that is perceived, some intrinsic nature. And then on top of that, so in the case of attachment, for example, we see positive qualities which that person has. Of course, every person has positive qualities. But not only do we perceive an intrinsic owner of these positive qualities, we also exaggerate those positive qualities. We exaggerate. It's not that we just perceive what is actually there. We focus only on the positive, and then our mind somehow seems to blow it up. This is what happens before attachment arises. So there's the basic misperception of the person, then their qualities, they become bigger than they are, and attachment is the mind that perceives all those exaggerated qualities and then holds on, wants to be, cannot be without. That's the state of mind. Okay? So when that state of mind arises, naturally, later on, worry arises that we may lose it. Or unhappiness arises if we can't get it. So those are kind of resulting awarenesses, worry, anxiety. So the more attachment there is, the stronger there's worry and anxiety. Okay? So it's just natural that the mind, when it perceives, there's a strong sense of an intrinsic I, and then a strong sense of positive qualities that could benefit that intrinsic I, very naturally. So once that has already taken place, there's nothing we can do but we'll attach to it. We're attached to the self, number one. This is our strongest attachment, to our own self, to our own I. First, we perceive there to be an I that doesn't exist, and perceive that to be more precious and more important than everyone else's. And then we attach to that. My happiness, that's most important. So it's a natural kind of process. So from the misperception, there's just, once you have those causes, then there's nothing really you can do. The results of those causes will give rise to this resulting attachment. So the misperception really is what's to blame. But understanding the attachment, how it is unrealistic. So, the point that you've made previously with regard to the person we're attached to, of course there is an actual person. But the actual person, the attachment doesn't perceive. There's a basis for the attachment, which is an actual person. But the attachment perceives only the good qualities in a totally exaggerated manner. Sometimes it projects positive qualities that don't even exist, right? It kind of adds, it kind of blows up the positiveness. So there is a basis for doing so. It's not like some person in the sky, but nonetheless, it adds things. So what it actually attaches to is something that's not there. And when we understand that it's not there, then the attachment can go. So there's some really interesting examples. I really like those examples. One of my teachers in a course he taught just recently that I translated for, he mentioned this, but I also saw this online one day and I was totally fascinated.